The wind howled through the Rocky Mountains of Colorado Territory, carrying with it the scent of snow and the promise of another brutal winter night. It was December 1862, and the small mining town of Silver Creek seemed like a sleeping ghost beneath the frozen blanket that covered its muddy streets. Margaret Sullivan adjusted her tattered shawl over her shoulders as she gazed through the fogged window of her cabin. At 42 years old, her face still carried traces of the beauty she once possessed, but the wear of 3 years of widowhood and poverty had carved deep lines around her green eyes. Her last candle flickered on the wooden table, casting dancing shadows across the sparse interior of what had once been a home filled with laughter and warmth. The cabin felt colder tonight, not just from the December chill that seeped through every crack in the weathered walls, but from the emptiness that had settled in her heart since tuberculosis claimed her husband Thomas 3 winters ago. The mine he had worked so desperately, the Lucky Strike claim just outside town, had yielded nothing but false hopes and broken dreams. Now it sat abandoned, another reminder of dreams buried beneath Colorado soil alongside the man she had loved more than life itself. Margaret counted her remaining coins for the 100th time that week, 17 cents. The metal pieces were worn smooth from her nervous handling, their edges soft with age and use. Enough for maybe 2 days of bread, but certainly not enough for another candle when this one burned out. She had already sold Thomas's mining tools, his rifle, his leather boots, even her wedding ring that had belonged to his grandmother. All that remained were memories growing dimmer by the day, and this final flame that held back the crushing darkness of her solitude. The wind rattled the single window pane, a sound she had grown to hate during the long nights when sleep eluded her. Sometimes she would lie awake listening to that relentless scratching and imagine it was Thomas trying to get back in, trying to warm her with his presence one more time. But morning always came with the cruel reminder that she was alone in a world that seemed determined to grind her down to nothing. A sharp knock at the door startled her from her melancholy thoughts. Who would be out in weather like this? The mercury had dropped below 0 hours ago, and even the hardiest prospectors had sought shelter in the saloons or boarding houses in town. The sound came again, more urgent this time, followed by a voice, so young and frightened it made her heart clench with recognition of another soul in distress. "Please, ma'am, I'm lost. I can't find my way back. Please, if anyone's in there, I need help." Margaret hurried to the door, her bare feet slapping against the cold wooden floor. She pulled it open, and the wind immediately tried to snatch the warmth from her cabin. Standing on her doorstep was a boy who couldn't have been more than 12 years old. His clothes were soaked through with melted snow, his lips blue with cold, and his dark hair was plastered to his head with ice crystals. He clutched a small canvas bag to his chest, as if it contained everything he owned in the world, which it probably did. "Good Lord, child, you're half frozen," she exclaimed, pulling him inside without hesitation. The boy stumbled as he crossed the threshold, his legs unsteady from exhaustion and cold. "What are you doing out there alone? Don't you know there are wolves in these mountains?" The boy's teeth chattered so violently he could barely speak. Margaret could see his whole body shaking beneath his wet clothes, and she immediately began stripping off her own shawl to wrap around his shoulders. "My name's Billy Garrett, ma'am. I was traveling with a wagon train heading west, but I wandered off this afternoon looking for firewood for the evening camp. I got turned around in the trees and couldn't find my way back. I've been walking for hours, following what I thought was the trail, and I saw your light through the trees." Margaret wrapped her shawl around the trembling boy, her maternal instincts overriding any concern for her own comfort. The fabric was thin and offered little warmth, but it was all she had. She guided him to the chair closest to her dying fireplace, where only glowing embers remained of her last piece of wood. The heat they provided was minimal but better than nothing. "There's no more wood," she said apologetically, gesturing toward the empty space where Thomas used to stack split logs during the autumn months. "But this candle will give us some warmth. You need to get out of those wet clothes before you catch your death. Pneumonia killed more miners in these mountains than cave-ins ever did." Billy looked at the single candle with wide, grateful eyes. Even in his exhausted state, he was observant enough to notice the bare shelves, the empty corners, the signs of poverty that Margaret had tried to hide from herself. "That's your only light, isn't it, ma'am? I don't want to take your last candle." Margaret's throat tightened with emotion. The boy was observant beyond his years, and his concern for her sacrifice touched something deep inside her chest that had been dormant for too long. She thought of her own childhood, of the nights when her mother had given up her own blanket so that Margaret could sleep warm. Some kindnesses were too important to refuse, even when accepting them meant hardship. "Don't you worry about that child. A boy your age shouldn't be alone in the dark, especially not on a night like this. The darkness can swallow a person whole if they're not careful." She rummaged through the wooden chest at the foot of her bed and found some of Thomas's old clothes that she had kept, hoping someday to trade them for food or supplies. The shirt and pants swam on Billy's small frame, but they were dry and warm. As she prepared the last of her cornmeal into a thin gruel, Billy sat quietly by the candle, his eyes reflecting the flame like a cat's in the night. She could see him, studying her cabin, taking in the details with the sharp awareness of someone who had learned to read his surroundings for survival. "Where are your parents, child?" Margaret asked gently as she stirred the meager meal in her one remaining pot. She tried to make her voice casual, but she could already guess the answer from the way Billy carried himself, the independence mixed with vulnerability that marked orphans of the frontier. "Dead, ma'am. Cholera took them last spring when we were crossing Kansas. Died 2 days apart, and we had to bury them beside the trail without proper coffins." Billy's voice was matter-of-fact, but Margaret could hear the underlying pain that he had learned to suppress. "I've been working odd jobs ever since, trying to make my way west to my uncle in California. The wagon master, Mr. Henderson, said I could travel with his train if I pulled my weight and didn't cause trouble. But I reckon he's moved on by now. Probably figures I'm wolf food or froze to death." The casual way Billy spoke of such hardship broke Margaret's heart. She had thought her own struggles were overwhelming, but this child had faced worse with a strength that both humbled and inspired her. She served him the gruel, keeping only a few spoonfuls for herself, watching as he tried to eat slowly despite his obvious hunger. "This is too much, ma'am," Billy protested, looking down at the bowl that contained most of their food. "You need to eat, too. You look like you haven't had a proper meal in weeks." "I'm not as hungry as you are," she lied, her stomach growling in protest. But seeing the boy's obvious relief as he ate made the hunger seem less important. "Besides, it does an old woman good to have company for supper. I haven't had a real conversation in so long I was starting to forget the sound of my own voice." Billy looked up from his bowl, his dark eyes serious beyond his years. "You're not old, ma'am. My mother was older than you when she died, and she always said that age was just a number anyway. What matters is what's in your heart. And you're the kindest person I've met since my ma died. I won't forget this kindness. Not ever." As the night deepened, the wind outside grew more violent, rattling the windows and sending drafts through every gap in the walls. The candle had burned down to barely an inch, its flame dancing precariously in the shifting air currents. Margaret knew it would last maybe another hour before they were plunged into complete darkness. She tried not to think about what would happen then, about the long night ahead without light or warmth. Billy had been quiet for a while, staring into the candle flame with an intensity that suggested he was wrestling with some internal decision. Finally, he spoke up, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mrs. Sullivan, I need to tell you something. I've been carrying something that might be worth something, but I don't know for sure. I've been afraid to show it to anyone because I didn't want to get my hopes up, but after what you've done for me tonight, I think you deserve to know." He opened his canvas bag with careful hands and withdrew a chunk of rock about the size of his fist. Even in the dim candlelight, Margaret could see veins of yellow running through the gray stone like frozen lightning. Her breath caught in her throat as she recognized the telltale signs that Thomas had taught her to identify during their years together. "I found this in a creek bed about 5 miles from here 3 days ago when I was looking for water to fill my canteen. The wagon master, Mr. Henderson, said it was probably just pyrite, fool's gold, but something about it seemed different. The way it caught the light, the weight of it in my hand. I was saving it to show my uncle in California, but if it's real gold, maybe it could help you get through the winter." Margaret took the rock in her trembling hands, her heart beginning to race as she examined it more closely. Thomas had taught her enough about minerals during their years together that she could recognize the difference between pyrite and genuine gold. The color was right, a deep yellow rather than the brassy shine of fool's gold. The weight was substantial, heavier than iron pyrite would be, and when she scratched it gently with her fingernail, the metal beneath showed the same rich color. "Billy, where exactly did you find this? Can you remember the specific location?" "Yes, ma'am. About 5 miles northeast of here, near a creek that runs down from the high country. There's an old mine shaft nearby. Looks like it's been abandoned for years. The entrance is mostly caved in, but through the rocks I could see into a chamber. Beyond, that's where I found this piece washed down from somewhere upstream." Margaret's pulse quickened as she processed this information. Northeast of town would put the location very close to several claims that had been worked and abandoned when the easy surface pickings played out. But if Billy was right about seeing an intact chamber beyond a cave-in, it was entirely possible that the original miners had missed something significant. Sometimes a tunnel collapse that seemed like disaster was actually nature's way of protecting a treasure for someone more deserving. "Billy, did you see any other rocks like this one? Any sign of where this might have come from originally?" "That's just it, ma'am. I didn't have time to look properly because I had to get back to the wagon train, but I could see more rocks scattered around the entrance to that mine. Some of them looked like they had the same yellow streaks. But the light was fading, and I was afraid of getting lost if I stayed too long." The candle flickered dangerously low, sending their shadows dancing wildly across the walls like spirits caught between worlds. Margaret stared at the rock in her hands, feeling the weight of possibility and desperation warring in her chest. This could be the answer to her prayers, or it could be another false hope that would leave her more broken than before. But something in her heart, something that had been silent since Thomas died, whispered that this was different. Margaret made a decision that surprised even herself. She stood up slowly, her joints protesting after sitting in the cold for so long, and walked to where Billy sat by the dying candle. The flame was so low now that it barely illuminated his young face, casting more shadow than light. "Billy, take this candle. There's maybe 30 minutes of light left in it, possibly less. That rock you found needs to be investigated properly, and the only way to do that is to go back to where you found it and see if there's more." Billy's eyes went wide with shock. "Ma'am, I can't take your last candle. You'll be left here alone, in the dark. What if something happens to you? What if I don't make it back?" Margaret pressed the candle holder into Billy's hands, her voice firm with a resolve she hadn't felt in years. "Listen to me, child. I've been sitting in this cabin for 3 years, letting the darkness win a little more each day. I've been so afraid of losing what little I had left that I forgot how to fight for something better. Maybe it's time I stopped being afraid of the dark and started being afraid of wasting the chances that life gives us. But ma'am, what if I don't find anything? What if I just waste your candle and leave you with nothing?" Margaret cupped Billy's face in her weathered hands, looking into his eyes with an intensity that made him stand up straighter. "Then at least we'll have tried. Sometimes hope is worth more than light, Billy." Sometimes the only way to find treasure is to be willing to lose everything you have for the chance to gain something better. Your parents didn't cross half a continent for you to die of cold and hunger in these mountains. They crossed it so you could have chances they never had. Billy stood slowly, holding the candle like it was made of precious crystal. The flame was so low now that it barely illuminated his young face, but his expression was one of determination mixed with profound gratitude. Margaret could see her own desperate hope reflected in his eyes, and she realized that in giving him the candle, she was also giving him the burden of her dreams. "If I find gold up there, Mrs. Sullivan, half of everything I discover is yours. I swear it on my parents' graves and on the memory of your husband. We'll be partners, equal shares, in whatever fate has waiting for us up in those mountains." Before Margaret could protest or change her mind, Billy had pulled on Thomas's old coat and slipped out into the howling wind, taking the last light with him. The cabin plunged into absolute darkness, and for a moment, the silence was overwhelming. Margaret sat in her chair, wrapped in Thomas's old coat that still carried the faint scent of his tobacco, and waited in the blackness. The night stretched endlessly ahead of her. Without the candle's warmth, the cabin grew colder by the hour, the temperature dropping until she could see her breath in the darkness. Margaret pulled every blanket she owned around herself and tried to imagine what Billy was doing out there in the storm. Was he safe? Had he found the old mine? Had he made it through the treacherous terrain without falling into a ravine or becoming lost again? Hours passed like years. Margaret dozed fitfully, waking each time the wind rattled the door or a branch scraped against the roof like skeletal fingers. She began to worry that Billy had become lost again, that her decision to send him out into the night had been not generous, but recklessly foolish. What if she never saw him again? What if her last act of kindness had led to tragedy? The guilt would be worse than poverty, worse than loneliness, worse than slowly starving in the dark. The cold seemed to seep into her very bones, making her joints ache and her muscles cramp. She tried to keep warm by moving around the cabin, but in the complete darkness, she kept bumping into furniture and walls. Finally, she returned to her chair and tried to distract herself by remembering better times. She thought about Thomas, about their early days together when they were both young and full of dreams. She remembered their wedding day when he promised her that they would strike it rich and build a mansion in Denver with electric lights and running water. But as the hours crept by, Margaret found herself thinking more about Billy than about her own losses. There was something special about that boy, something that reminded her of Thomas when he was young and still believed he could conquer the world. Billy had that same fierce determination, that same willingness to risk everything for a chance at something better. Maybe that was why she had been willing to give him her last candle. Maybe she recognized in him the spirit that she had lost somewhere along the way. The wind outside began to die down as the night wore on, and Margaret could hear other sounds in the relative quiet. An owl hooting from the pine trees behind her cabin, the distant howl of a wolf pack somewhere up in the high country, the creak and groan of her cabin settling in the cold. Each sound seemed magnified in the darkness, taking on an ominous quality that made her imagination run wild. What if Billy had encountered wolves on his way to the mine? What if he had fallen through thin ice on a creek crossing? What if the old mine shaft had collapsed further when he tried to explore it? A 12-year-old boy, alone in the wilderness with nothing but a dying candle and a desperate hope, faced dangers that could kill a grown man. Margaret began to pray, something she hadn't done much since Thomas died, asking God to protect the boy and bring him safely back to her. Just as the first pale hint of dawn was beginning to lighten the eastern sky, Margaret heard voices outside. Not just Billy's voice, but several men talking excitedly, their words carrying clearly in the cold morning air. She stumbled to the door in the pre-dawn gloom and pulled it open to find Billy standing there with 3 other men, all of them carrying lanterns and looking as if they hadn't slept all night. Their faces were streaked with dirt and sweat despite the cold, and their eyes held the unmistakable gleam of men who had seen something extraordinary. "Mrs. Sullivan!" Billy called out, his voice cracking with excitement and exhaustion. "You need to come with us. Right now. You need to see what we found up there." One of the men, whom Margaret recognized as Jake Morrison, the town's assayer, stepped forward with his hat in his hands. Jake was a serious man in his 50s, not given to flights of fancy or exaggeration. If he was excited about something, it was worth paying attention to. "Ma'am, this boy here has made the most significant gold discovery in Colorado territory since the Pikes Peak rush. That old mine he found, the one everyone thought was played out, it isn't played out at all. The original miners just missed the main vein because of the cave-in. They were working the wrong direction entirely." Margaret's legs nearly gave out beneath her. She gripped the door frame for support, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. "What are you saying exactly? Please, I need to understand what you mean." Billy rushed to her side, his young face beaming despite the fatigue etched there. "Your candle burned out just as I found the entrance to the main chamber, Mrs. Sullivan, but there was just enough light left to see the walls. The walls are streaked, with gold so thick you can scratch it off with your fingernails. We're not talking about flakes or dust. We're talking about veins of solid gold running through the rock like rivers." The third man, whom Margaret didn't recognize, introduced himself as Samuel Davies, a mining engineer from Denver who had been passing through town on business when Billy brought his discovery to the assayer's attention in the early morning hours. "Mrs. Sullivan, I've been in this business for 20 years, and I've examined mines from California to the Dakotas. I've never seen anything like what's in that mountain. We're looking at a discovery that could make both of you wealthy beyond anything either of you has ever dreamed." Jake Morrison nodded emphatically. "Ma'am, we've taken preliminary samples from 3 different locations in the main chamber. Every single sample shows gold content that's off the charts. We're estimating that there could be anywhere from $50,000 to $100,000 worth of gold in the accessible chambers alone, and we haven't even begun to explore the deeper tunnels." Margaret stood in her doorway, still wrapped in blankets, trying to process what she was hearing. Her mind seemed unable to grasp the magnitude of what they were telling her. $50,000 to $100,000 was more money than most people saw in a lifetime. It was enough to buy half the businesses in Silver Creek, enough to live comfortably for decades without ever worrying about money again. "But Billy," she said softly, her voice barely audible, "you found this yourself. The gold is yours by right. I just gave you a candle." Billy shook his head firmly, his expression serious despite his obvious excitement. "No, ma'am. That candle you gave me was the difference between finding that mine and dying lost in the dark. Without your light, I would never have made it to the mine, let alone into the chamber where the real treasure is hidden. We're partners now, just like I promised. Equal shares, equal say in everything we do." Samuel Davies cleared his throat. "If I may, Mrs. Sullivan, the boy is right. In the mining business, partnerships are common when one party provides the stake and another provides the labor or knowledge. In this case, you provided the means for the discovery to happen. Without your candle, there would be no mine to discuss." "Jake," Morrison stepped forward. "Ma'am, if you're agreeable to it, I'd like to help you both file proper claims on that mine today. With winter coming on hard, we can't do much large-scale excavation until spring, but we can extract some of the more accessible gold and secure your legal rights to the entire claim. There are going to be a lot of people very interested in this. Discovery once word gets out." Margaret looked at Billy, this remarkable child who had appeared at her door like an answer to prayers she had been afraid to pray. In the growing daylight, she could see that his clothes were torn and dirty from his night's work, but his eyes were bright with triumph and exhaustion. He had risked his life on nothing more than a hope and a dying candle, and somehow he had found treasure. "Billy Garrett," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "I think we're going to be just fine." The wind had died down completely, and the first rays of true sunlight were painting the snowy peaks surrounding Silver Creek in shades of gold that seemed to promise better days ahead. As the group made their way toward town to file their claims and begin the legal process of establishing their ownership, Margaret reflected on the strange and wonderful turns that life could take. 3 years ago, she had watched her husband die coughing up blood in the very bed she had slept in alone ever since. She had sold everything they owned, trying to pay for medicine that didn't work and food that barely sustained her. She had given up on tomorrow, existing from one day to the next without purpose or hope, waiting for death to claim her as it had claimed Thomas. But in giving away her last candle to a lost child, she had somehow found her way back to the light. The gold in the mine was real, more real than anything she had dared to hope for in the darkest days of her widowhood. But the true treasure was the reminder that kindness, even when it costs us everything we have left, has a way of coming back to us magnified beyond our wildest imagination. Billy walked beside her as they made their way down the mountain path toward town, still clutching the canvas bag that now held samples of genuine gold ore. Every few steps, he would look up at her with a gratitude so pure and overwhelming that it made her throat tight with unshed tears. This boy, this wonderful, brave child, had given her back her future. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said as they approached. The main street of Silver Creek, where early risers were already beginning their daily routines. "After we get rich from our mine, I'm going to buy you a whole crate of the finest candles money can buy. Beeswax candles from back east, the kind that burn clean and bright for hours and hours." Margaret laughed for the first time in months, the sound carrying across the morning air like a bell. "Billy, my dear boy, I think we're going to need them. We have a lot of dark places left to light up in this world." The widow's candle mine, as it came to be known throughout the territory, produced over $200,000 in gold over the next 5 years. Margaret Sullivan became one of the wealthiest women in Colorado, using her fortune to establish an orphanage in Denver and fund dozens of other charitable endeavors. She built a proper school for Silver Creek, complete with a library and laboratory, and established a medical clinic that provided free care to miners and their families. Billy Garrett grew up to become a respected businessman and mining engineer, but he never forgot the lesson he learned that snowy December night. He built a successful career on the principle that sometimes the most valuable thing you can do is share your light with someone who needs it more than you do. When he came of age, he used his share of the mine's profits to establish a foundation that provided emergency assistance to orphaned children throughout the American West. The story of the widow's candle became legendary throughout Colorado territory. Newspaper reporters came from as far away as California to interview Margaret and Billy about their remarkable partnership. But the detail that captured everyone's imagination was the simple truth at the heart of their story: that a single act of generosity, performed without expectation of reward, had transformed 2 desperate lives into something extraordinary. Margaret lived to see Silver Creek grow from a ramshackle mining camp into a prosperous city with paved streets, gas lighting, and all the amenities of modern civilization. Much of that growth was funded by her generosity, as she used her wealth to improve the lives of everyone in the community that had become her home. She never remarried, but she was never alone again. Billy remained her business partner and surrogate son throughout her life, and together they created a legacy that extended far beyond the gold they had pulled from the mountain. When Margaret died peacefully in her sleep in 1889 at the age of 69, the entire city of Silver Creek attended her funeral. Billy, now a successful man in his 40s, delivered a eulogy that brought tears to every eye in the packed church. He spoke of the night she had given him her last candle, and how that single act of kindness had changed not just their lives, but the lives of countless others who had benefited from her generosity over the years. The cabin where Margaret Sullivan once sat, alone in the darkness, still stands on the outskirts of what is now the thriving city of Silver Creek. It has been preserved as a historical landmark, maintained by the Sullivan Foundation as a reminder of the power of kindness in desperate circumstances. A small brass plaque by the door reads, "Here lived a woman who learned that hope, like a candle, gives more light when it's shared." Every December, on the anniversary of that fateful night, someone places a single lit candle in the window of the old cabin. The tradition began with Billy Garrett and has been continued by his descendants and the citizens of Silver Creek ever since. The candle burns through the night, a beacon for any lost traveler who might need shelter, and a reminder that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can illuminate the entire world. And in the mining camps and settlements throughout the American West, prospectors and pioneers still tell the story of the widow who gave away her last candle and found a fortune in the darkness. But those who understand the true meaning of the tale know that the real treasure wasn't the gold they pulled from the mountain. It was the reminder that in our darkest moments, when we feel we have nothing left to give, that's often exactly when giving what little we have can change everything.